It's quite clear upon first viewing of Infernax that it is a homage to the classic Castlevania games, and if you're a fan of those, then I'm sure you're going to be a fan of this. In it, you play as a legendary hero who has just returned to his homeland, only to discover that it is being ravaged by black magic and demons. It is then up to you to traverse the open world to navigate a series of dungeons in order to defeat the enemies and return peace to the land. Now, before the game even starts, it's worth noting that the game has a rather humorous adult content warning that there is plenty of gore, adult language and demons in a various state of sexy undress. This tongue-in-cheek disclaimer sets the tone, letting you know that the game itself doesn't really take itself too seriously. As humorous as this disclaimer is, it's worth noting that the gore aspect is certainly true. I was quite surprised to see just how graphic this game is, especially the death animations of some of the enemies. It kind of reminds me of how the film RoboCop looks kid-friendly and everything from the exterior, however when you get into the film and start watching it you realise just how gory and graphic it actually is. Considering its 8/16-bit aesthetic, it's quite surprising and impressive just how graphic and gory the developers have made this game. The game plays pretty much how you might expect, with you only being able to attack left and right. However, when you attain different power-ups and different moves, it allows you to traverse the map in different ways and also attack enemies above and below you. The game does start off quite difficult, but once you've gained enough experience and points to level up and buy new equipment and moves, the game does become actually quite manageable. There are a total of 5 different dungeons before you can take on the final dungeon and face the final boss. Now, when I say dungeons, these aren't the dungeons that you might expect in a Zelda game filled with different puzzles, but rather a series of differently connected rooms. These dungeons just require a little bit of exploration in order to find keys that might hinder your progress before you can reach the final boss. The main difficulty of these dungeons is actually surviving them and traversing them rather than any puzzles you might encounter. And speaking of the bosses within this game are great. The bosses themselves aren't particularly challenging, they only have about 3 or 4 different moves, and once you learn their pattern, they're relatively straightforward to complete. However, just because they're not difficult in completing in themselves, they are a lot of fun in learning their attack patterns and learning to adapt accordingly. Again, it's the first few bosses that you encounter that are the most challenging due to you not having leveled up, but again, once you've leveled up and increased your powers, they're certainly more manageable as the game progresses. Throughout your journey you will also be offered optional side quests to undertake. What's interesting here is you're often given choices as to how to complete the side quests. You can undertake these quests as requested or take an optional route, and there's not always a definitive understanding of what's necessarily the good or bad decision to make. And this is where the morale system comes into play. For example, you might have to go and kill a specific demon, however when you encounter the demon they will give you an understanding as to why they're behaving the way that they are. As such, you can either choose to kill the demon or listen to them and take pity on them, allowing them to live. Sometimes killing them is the right decision, however sometimes leaving them to live will have beneficial qualities later on. The decisions that you have to make therefore aren't always clear cut, and it's always interesting to see how these stories can play out. So then, as I say, this then feeds into the morale system, adding points to the good and bad structure of your character. If you continue down the good path, this is basically the correct way of playing the game, and the game is relatively straightforward. Going down the bad path, however, does change the way your character plays, giving you different abilities and different weapons to use. These obviously then lead into different good and bad endings for the game, of which there are several. As I say, this game doesn't take itself too seriously, and one of the more light-hearted aspects of this game is that it includes its own Game Genie. Now, for those of you who are far too young to remember what a Game Genie was, this was basically an attachment you added to your SNES cartridges, your Nintendo cartridges, your Sega cartridges, which allowed you to enter codes and manipulate the game. Typically these codes would give you things like infinite lives, invincibility, the ability to have your cat make you a sandwich, things like that. Once you have completed the game then gives you a Game Genie code that you then enter within the game and allows you a lot of freedom and fun to play about with the game. This obviously then gives you an incentive to replay the game in the manner that you might want. Rather brilliantly, and again another homage to the old Konami games of old, the Konami code itself actually works on the title screen. This then turns your knight character into a gun-wielding maniac, and the game plays more like a Contra game rather than a Castlevania game. It's honestly a lot of fun. The game isn't too long, like I say, it doesn't take itself too seriously, and if you are a fan of this genre, this is a great little modern take on those classic games.